Greetings, book lovers everywhere, and welcome to E-Train Talks. I'm your host, E-Train. I'm a middle grade book reviewer, literacy advocate, and podcast host. And every day's a good day on E-Train Talks because I get to talk to so many incredibly talented storytellers. There's one genre in particular that's very close to my heart that I haven't really highlighted very much in E-Train Talks, and that's historical fiction. Historical fiction can dive deep into wars, personal experiences in any time period from thousands of years ago to decades ago. And my guest today is an expert in tackling diverse and interesting historical moments in time in her writing. I'm, of course, talking about the incredible author Veera Hiranandani. And she, who is sitting across from me virtually, is the Newbery honor-winning author of The Night Diary, the meaningful and amazing tale that was actually my class read aloud in 6th grade. It details the story of Nisha, Amil, and their family as they make their way from Pakistan to India after the partition of India. And since they were Hindu, they couldn't stay in the newly formed Pakistan or their city of Mirpur Khas. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm just going by what my 6th grade teacher said. So
Yeah,
maybe she
yeah,
was
Precauce. Yep,
okay.
that's how I.
So I had never learned about the partition before reading aloud The Night Diary, and it truly educated me and made me think. So it's such an honor to have you here today, Vera. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join me.
Well, thank you, E-Train, for that incredible introduction. So I'm honored to be here with you and talking about my books and why I wrote them and all of that.
Well, I talked a bit about The Night Diary in the introduction, but this is really all about Emil and the After, your newest book, and I read an advanced reader's copy and I loved it from the first page. I didn't really know that there needed to be an extra ending to The Night Diary, but it really felt needed after reading the story. So that kind of transitions us to a first question in that world of The Night Diary and Emil and the After. So both books are just beautiful, and I hope everyone tuning in will read them. And not all sequels work, but Emil and the After was a beautiful continuation and another must-read of yours. So, what prompted you to write a sequel to The Night Diary, or had it always been planned?
Really good question, and thank you for all of that. That's very kind, and I'm so glad that you enjoyed it. And I
Yeah.
love hearing your perspective. I didn't plan to write a sequel or a companion book or however. I mean, you could read A Meal in the After on its own, but I don't recommend it. I think it's a richer experience to read both, but you could if that's the first book you found. So it kind of is its own story and has enough backstory in it to kind of read it as a single book. But after I wrote The Night Diary, maybe about a year later, I had spent a lot of time talking about the Night Diary, visiting schools, getting interviewed, and I started to wonder myself what the characters were up to. I kind of missed being in the world of that story. And I kept hearing from young readers that they would be really psyched to have a sequel or a companion book. And a lot of them were interested in Emil's experience and point of view. And I certainly had thought about that. And so it wasn't kind of the first time I had been imagining something like that, but hearing my young readers being interested in that definitely gave me the motivation to try. And so I wanted to follow the story and the characters, but also do something different with it. And so I felt that writing it in third person, not in a diary format, because Emil wouldn't he doesn't love writing and he wouldn't sort of want to keep his own diary. So I chose the third person and his perspective, and that gave me a new lens on the story, even though I was following their lives and the same characters.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you made a companion to The Night Diary. And like your young readers, I definitely agree that Emil's story needed to be told.
Mhm.
And speaking of that, Emil is just one of my favorite characters in all of middle grade, just because he's so complex and he's been through so much, yet still he's curious, he's silly, but he also adds that somber effect he has it now after what happened to him during the partition. He's really complex, and it's not always a common occurrence for authors to include such deep characteristics that kids can possess. But we really can through our experiences and what we've been through in our lives. We
Yeah.
kind of grow. So, we all experience loss, regret, and joy just like Emil. And how did you go about shaping Emil's character? Or did it kind of feel already easy to you? You knew what you wanted to do.
Well, certain things can feel, I don't know if even the word is easy, because definitely nothing's easy about
Yeah.
writing. Certain things do flow. And when you kind of click in that creative flow space, things will just kind of come to you, and feel sort of easy in that moment. And I think that once I kind of begin with the point of view I'm starting in, I've done a lot of thinking about the character and kind of sort of practiced almost being in their point of view in my own head and kind of connecting my younger self with that character. And so by the time I start writing, I'm sort of, there's a part of me that's kind of used to being in that point of view already. But then of course I get to know the character as I'm writing. And I was a pretty introspective kid. I was kind of quiet. I spent a lot of time observing other people. I had to change schools, and in my new school, I didn't have a lot of friends. And so I spent certainly the first year in that school doing a lot of thinking. And I had many complex thoughts. And I feel, as you do, that young people are very complex. And I really do remember what I was like and what I thought about back then. And I have a son and daughter, and we have pretty intense talks. And they were younger. They're 18 and 20 now, but obviously I've known them their whole lives. And they've had really complex thoughts about the world too.
Yeah.
And I was thinking also about my father, who some of this story is inspired by his journey. He had to leave his home when he was 9 during the partition of India, and went from Mir Prakash to Jodhpur to Bombay, Mumbai. And he also experienced some things really young that were hard and scary because of the partition. And so he had that spirit. He's a very sort of like adventurous, lighthearted person, but at the same time knows what it's like to experience really difficult things. So he has that kind of duality. And I was kind of imagining him as a kid. So that's all that went into it.
And I certainly could tell in the story that Emil's emotions felt so real. And they connected to your father's as well, which makes a lot of sense. And so, digging into your backstory, we've talked a lot about your characters, but I read that that you didn't just start writing children's books, you also edited them at Simon and Schuster. And I often think about editing stories myself. So, why did you decide to pursue editing? And what was that experience like? And in the process, do you feel like you became a better writer from it?
Absolutely. And I think it's great that you would think about that. You're so much more prepared already than I was in the way that you're immersing yourself with books, but not just, I mean, I always read, but I didn't always think critically about them. I didn't always talk about the books that I was reading. So that's so great that you're kind of giving yourself that background if you're interested in editing or just anything in the publishing world. Um, I really just wanted to learn about the publishing world. I felt like it was kind of a natural step after I went to graduate school and studied fiction writing. And I felt like, well, I have these skills and I love
Yeah.
books and I love writing and I need a job. I think publishing probably is a good step. So I actually started off working in adult publishing in at Simon and Schuster for mostly nonfiction books, and they were kind of like business books and self-help books. And I learned a lot of things. But I started to wander around the children's department, and looking at, first of all, the beautiful illustrated books, and just kind of poking around and sort of thinking about it. I was started to think about my own first book, The Whole Story of Half a Girl. And I just felt like that was going to be something that I was going to work on personally. And I just sort of shifted my whole world rather than looking at kind of the adult fiction world. I was like, I think, I think I want to explore this. So then I moved over to the children's department, and I ended up doing some really fun work there. I worked with a lot of media tie-ins. So we would do the book versions of big media brands like Dora the Explorer and Blue's Clues and
Yeah.
Bob the Builder and all this stuff. So we would do like picture books and activity books and things like that. So it wasn't, it was really fun. And I observed everything in children's publishing because some of my friends were editors working on more of the books that I ended up writing, like historical fiction and contemporary fiction. So it was great. I knew that I was probably not going to do that for my whole life because I really did have a dream. I was one of those editors that actually really wanted to be a writer. I admit that. And so it was great. I spent about 6 years, learned everything I could. I made some nice contacts, and then I was able to launch my publishing career. So, and
Yeah, and
haven't.
that's super cool. And I'm also curious, did you edit your own books in a sense, or did you have to hire another editor?
Hmm. You mean when I was first writing,
Yeah,
like the
when you
whole
were first
half of the
writing,
book?
yeah.
Yeah, I had a lot of writing friends from my graduate program. So I have had different writing groups over the years, and I had some trusted friends that I could always show my writing. My husband's a screenwriter, so we've always talked about story and story structure. So he always reads my manuscripts. So with that, I was able to get enough feedback, and it took me many years to get that first manuscript. I mean, I spent probably about 6 years on it, just getting to the point that I had a draft that I wanted to try to send out to editors and agents. Um, so yeah, many years, many revisions to feel good about it.
And it all ended up here with
Yeah,
so many
and
amazing.
also that took many years. I did get that book published, but then there were a few more years after that, and then I published a chapter book series, and then a few more years after that, and then I published the Night Diary, which was the book that kind of, gave me a bigger audience, which was really exciting. And yeah,
Yeah.
so I'm not the fastest writer in the world. There's some people who can write, a book a year, no problem. I've never been that person, and I'm okay with that. I need the time that I need, and I'm proud of my work. And so it's wonderful that people can do that. And I think there are people that are writing for series, and they really need to be able to be good and fast. So, you know, it takes all styles.
Yep. Every author has a different journey.
Yes, absolutely.
So you grew up as a member of two cultures. Your father was Hindu and your mother was Jewish American. That's not something you hear about every day. And I think it's super important to write stories based upon both of your backgrounds.
Mhm.
So do you feel the same way? And in your bio, you shared that you hadn't met any other kids like you when you were young. But have you discovered a community that shares similar experiences or just cultures as you?
Yes. So when I grew up in a small town, Connecticut, and there were very few Jewish kids and very few Hindu kids, and nobody I knew that had both backgrounds in their family. And I used to go to a really small school, and we all knew each other really well. So it didn't feel different in that sense. It was like an extended family. But when I switched schools and went to a much larger public school, people started to ask me questions. I just felt so much more different than I had had before, and I was really surprised by that, because I really didn't think that it was that big a deal.
Yeah.
And so I did feel sort of other in that sense. And in some ways, it gave me kind of material to write about. I've always been writing about that experience in one way or another. And sometimes I'm inhabiting characters that have a different background, like in How to Find What You're Not Looking For. She's a girl who has two Jewish parents. And that was something that I just always wondered what it would be like if I had two Hindu parents or two Jewish parents. And my cousins were, from families like that. So I grew up with my cousins who had sorry. Okay. Sorry about the phone call. I can start answering that question again. But I grew up where my cousins had two Indian parents, and I watched kind of some of the things that they did in their family that I didn't do in my family, and the same with my Jewish cousins. And I didn't have a bat mitzvah, but my cousins had, bar and bat mitzvah. So I would sort of observe that. But I think my parents decided to kind of live a very secular life, and that was the way that they handled their kind of interfaith family. But as I grew up, I became more curious about both of my backgrounds. And so I've written very directly connected to my backgrounds in one way or another. And that's just been a way for me to completely understand where I come from, to center that experience of being biracial, coming from an interfaith family, and also those identities in a separate way too. And so I've met, through the book world, I have more of a diverse community than I've ever had in my life, which is incredible. And I just tend to feel more comfortable in groups of people with all kinds of backgrounds. That
Yeah.
is absolutely the place that I feel at home in that way. So I've met some people that have my exact background, but not many, not many.
Yeah. And that's the beauty of the middle grade book world and really all the book worlds. It's just so diverse, so many stories to tell.
Yeah. Yeah. So exactly. And we
Yeah.
need to keep telling them. If somebody is writing about the partition or writing about having a Hindu and Jewish background, I hope there are many more people. I hope my book only inspires more stories about that subject, because everybody's going to have their own experience and their lens on that similar topic.
Yeah. And unlike the Night Diary, A Meal and the After included a few illustrations upon the pages of the story. And as we learned in the Night Diary, Emil has a true gift and love of drawing and illustrations. And in the story, we've discovered that it kind of connected him to his mom. So,
Yeah.
is there a story behind why you chose Emil to love drawing? And
Yes.
also, how'd you go about finding somebody to create the illustrations? Was it the cover artist, you, or maybe somebody else?
Not me. Although I do love drawing. I do love drawing. And so that is a part of me. I drew a lot when I was younger. And so Emil's love for drawing is definitely inspired by my own love for drawing and the way that I expressed myself when I was younger. So I love to write and I love to draw, and I love to make things. I think it felt really empowering for me to kind of make things and not think so much about, is this play that I wrote good? Is this drawing good? Especially when I was younger, I just
Yeah,
needed to do it and needed to express myself that way. So I created these characters, Nisha and Emil, who for their own reasons need to make sense of the world, and use art, whether it's writing or drawing, to express themselves and feel that kind of empowering. Like I may not be able to control everything out there, but I can control this space here, whatever story I'm writing or the story I'm telling about my life or the drawing that I'm making about what I'm feeling. And so Nisha, in the beginning of the book, when they've now left Mirprakash, and we end the Night Diary where they're in Jodhpur, but we start A Meal in the After where they had to leave again, and their father got a new job. He's a doctor, and he got a new job at a hospital in Bombay. And so that was part of following my own father's family story. They, a few years later, not as quick as the characters do in the Night Diary, in A Meal in the After in the Night Diary, but they also made that journey and ended up in Mumbai. And so that's the area of India that I'm most familiar with, that I visited the most. And so I wanted to kind of write a story set there and explore that a little more. So Neil expresses that he wants to do something kind of like Nisha's diary, but he doesn't want to write. He doesn't love writing. He doesn't really want to keep a diary every day. And he's already a really good artist, and Nisha knows that. And she suggests, well, why don't you keep a drawing journal? And they both are sort of expressing themselves to their mother, who they never knew, who died in childbirth. And this is a way that Emil can express himself. And so I had this idea. I talked to my editor, can we have these drawings? I love drawing and I used to draw a lot, but I've kind of gotten out of practice. I'm nowhere near professional level. So we need an illustrator. And I had met Prashant Miranda, who did the illustrations, at a book festival in India when I was touring for the Night Diary. And I loved his drawings, and they just seemed like the right kind of sensibility for this sort of journal drawing. And they contacted him and he was available. And so that's how we ended up with those drawings. And I love them.
Yeah, I think all the readers who discover Emil and the After through this interview, or just in general, I think we all we love the drawings so much, and it adds so much character as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I love them too.
So I found the fact that you included details of Emil and Nisha after the partition very interesting. Most middle grade stories typically end on a high note and often leave out some of the more serious or disturbing experiences or feelings. Like Emil and Nisha, they'd finally made it to India and they were safe. But that wasn't their ending. They had another story to tell, more of their story to tell. And I read that your father left Pakistan as a child in the partition as well, just like Emil and Nisha. So how much of Emil and the After was creative inspiration? How much was in direct parallel with your father's life?
Yeah, you asked such good questions. And now my mind is like, oh, what aspect am I going to dive in first? So it was absolutely inspired by my father's experiences and my grandparents' experiences, but kind of in more of a general way. Like they ended up leaving Jodhpur probably about 3 years after they got there, um, and for slightly different reasons. But then my father from the age of, I guess, about 13, 14, grew up in Bombay and then came to the US after being in Bombay. So that certainly mirrors some of his life and some of his experiences, but he wasn't quite as young going through that. And he didn't have as hard a time. And that's part of why he's very comfortable kind of sharing everything. It was scary. They had to leave. He was told like the day before to pack a bag. They got on a train and they made it safely, but they didn't have to walk through the desert, and
Mm.
they didn't have, they didn't come in direct contact with violence, and they didn't starve, and they didn't not be able to find water. But that happened to so many other people. And so during my research, when I would talk to friends and family, and also just people I don't know, just, all the collections of oral histories about the partition, I wanted to kind of create this sort of mishmash, to kind of nod to a lot of the different experiences that happened during the partition. So that's how I kind of combined all of those things. But also to your question about continuing their story, a lot of stories about any kind of crisis or world event, or refugee story, or story where, characters are experiencing war, um, and they survive. Often the story is about that immediate crisis and then the survival, hopefully.
Yeah.
And then the story ends like they made it, they're okay, and the end. And I wrote the night diary like that. But
Yeah.
I was thinking a lot about, well, what happens after we survive? What are we left with? How are we strengthened? And how are we wounded in ways that we do carry with us? And so I wanted to explore this after part and how they rebuild their lives, how Nisha and Emil specifically are affected by some of the traumatic things that they went through. And I think a lot of times we sort of talk to kids in the sense of we want, as adults, we want them to stay hopeful and to keep going just like we do.
Yeah.
Um, and so we want them to be resilient, but there are things that there's traumas that we have to kind of respect and allow space for, and that it's okay, and it's a natural part of going through something very difficult. So I wanted to portray characters who were dealing with some of that stuff at the same time trying to feel hopeful and joyful about their lives, but it was going to be both things, um, that they were carrying with them. And so that's why, I wanted to focus the story on the after.
Yeah. Emil and the After.
Right.
So, my next question for you is about how to find what you're not looking for. So, I was super excited when I found out about A Meal in the After as I'd read The Night Diary. But I also remembered that you wrote How to Find What You're Not Looking For, a story that I received from PJ Arway, and I loved it so much. It's so unique, it's thought-provoking, and it's filled with so much detail. And I'm Jewish, and I really appreciate all the Jewish themes and cultural references that you included in the story. So, with everything happening in the world today, it's just so important to spotlight Jewish themed stories. So, can you share a little bit about how to find what you're not looking for and why it's an important book to read today?
Yes. Well, for me, I was writing the story kind of inspired by my own parents' marriage.
Mhm.
And my parents got married in 1968, 1 year after the Loving versus Virginia ruling that banned all laws against interracial marriage in the country. They got married in Connecticut. It was legal for them to get married in Connecticut, but I often thought about what if they were in another state a year before? What would have happened? How would that have shaped their decision? And when they got married, my mother's family, my Jewish grandparents, were not in support of the marriage. And my father's family, his parents weren't living anymore. So he didn't quite have that parental influence. But um, some of his relatives felt that, he should marry somebody that was Hindu. And they decided that, they were in love and this was important. And they kind of paved the way and were sort of pioneers in their space and
Yeah.
got married anyway. And they are still happily married after, I think, 55 years at this point. So I'm very glad that they made that decision. But this book was exploring some of that from a different perspective, also exploring a fully Jewish character, asking these questions about why her parents aren't in support of her older sister's marriage, or she falls in love with an Indian college student and they want to get married. Um, and so I was kind of exploring some of those complex feelings that the main character sees her parents treat Raj, who's the Indian college student, as kind of the other in the situation. And she just really questions that, at the same time comes to sort of an understanding of why her parents feel so strongly about this, their own Jewish identity, and the things that they've had to go through to kind of, when you're Jewish,
Yeah.
that they've faced their own prejudice. And so that's, those are all the things that I'm kind of writing about there. And it is more important than ever. And without getting into, any
Yeah.
specifics, in the tragic situation in the Middle East, I think it's just so important for any marginalized communities. And the Jewish community, we're a very small community,
Mhm.
and we've been historically marginalized, forever. And so it's really important to humanize anybody with any kind of marginalized, who are part of a marginalized community. And so I think now more than ever, um, to keep humanizing Jewish characters and Jewish experiences. I think that's really important, not only for the Jewish community, but for everyone else. So.
Absolutely. And my next question for you is in this kind of similar scope, most of your stories are historical fiction. And what is it about the genre that keeps inspiring you to continue writing historical fiction?
Well, unfortunately, I keep seeing so many of the same themes, of the histories that I'm connected to, that the historical fiction that I write about are experiences and events that I am personally connected to, because I kind of need that personal connection to sort of motivate me and give me a reason of why I'm exploring this specific area of history. So I think that that will always be something that I lead with, that if I write more historical fiction, it's going to be places that I'm connected to, either through my own experiences or my family history. That's just something I need to do. And so I think that's why I've turned towards that, because they were experiences that happened to, my mother's family or my father's family, that I'm connected to. And I just need to make sense of it. It's always
Yeah.
these places like the partition of India, where the more I learned about it, the more I had questions and the more I wondered how these things happened. And the lines were being drawn and people were being divided.
Mhm.
along religious lines, and how quickly it turned them against each other. And how could that happen? And unfortunately, we see these things happening over and over again. And so, in some ways, the more I'm curious and the more I ask questions, the more questions I end up having. Um, and I'm not sure, I want to try to understand humanity and human beings and why we kind of sometimes really treat each other horribly. I don't know if I have the answer yet, but I keep going back in time to try to figure that out. So I think that's why I've written a lot of historical fiction.
Yeah, and historical fiction can really make readers think and think about the past, think about the present as well, and how that past affects us, and
Mhm.
also the future as well, because people always say history repeats itself. But sometimes, if it's bad history, we want to find a way to stop it from repeating itself. And stories like yours highlight what we can do to continue the fight for good.
Yeah. Yep. So that's my way that I can kind of put that in the world. Because I'm not other things, there are so many ways that we can kind of help our communities. And this is the way that I feel like I can. And also selfishly, I just really love to write and make up stories. So it's a win-win, I guess.
Yeah. So, this is a new question as it is 2024. So, can you share what your favorite stories of 2023 were? And what are some must-read books that we should discover and read in 2024?
Yes. So 2023 for me, I tend to not always be up on things because I read in such different ways for different
Yeah.
reasons. So I'm just kind of looking at a point of view and reading that, or I get obsessed with an author and then I just read all of their books. And so 2023 actually for me was not the greatest year as far as keeping up with things because I tended to be reading from past years more. I did a really deep dive with all Renee Watson's books. I love her so much, and Rita Williams Garcia's books.
Mhm.
But I don't think they had anything. Well, maybe Renee did, but I'm not sure if they had anything in 2023. But one book that I did love, and it's getting a lot of attention, and I'm really excited about it, is called The Lost Year by Catherine Marsh. Um, and so I really loved that book. And another book that I think came out in 2022, not 2023, was Tumble by Celia Perez. I really loved that book. So that's some of my past recommendations, not in exactly the way you asked the question, but in 2024 there are a lot of books I'm looking forward to, so I'm going to try to be more up on things. But I kind of wrote it down to make sure I had all the titles and the names right. But there are two middle grade books that are coming out this spring that are also about the partition of India, and I was just really excited that there are more stories, middle grade stories in the US now about um, the partition, to kind of show that sort of
Yeah.
diversity in that sense. So the Partition Project by Sadia Faruqi is coming out in February, and The Line of the Sky by Ritu Hemnani is coming out, I think, in May, and they're both based on the partition. Um, and one of my favorite authors, Ruth Behar,
Oh,
has
yeah.
a new book out. I love her books, and I was able to blurb her most recent book coming out, I think March, and it's called Across So Many Seas. So I already read that, but it's
It's
great.
amazing.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. And Max in the House of Spies by Adam Gidwitz. I want to read that book. I haven't, but I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I've got to write some of these down because I want to be up up to date on everything going on in 2024 because middle grade is so it's just advancing in so many ways. There's so many more diverse stories. They're tackling topics that haven't really been discussed very much. So I'm
Yes.
so looking forward to what's going to happen in 2024.
And thanks to you that you're sort of amplifying our voices and diverse voices, because there, with so many book bans everywhere,
Yeah.
we need to just keep going that direction. So thank you for the work that you do.
And thank you to you and every single author who's celebrating diverse voices and shining a light on stories that need to be told. And hopefully we can, if we all band together, pun intended, we can try and put an end to book banning. It's gonna be hard, but I think we can all do it.
There are a lot of us, so yes,
Yeah.
we can do it.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is the final question of the interview, and I've loved this talk, and I hope all of you as well have. So it's kind of sad, but it's also a question that every single person who's been on E-Train Talks has answered. And no shame in saying even your own characters. If you could be, or if you could meet any literary character, it could be your favorite author or your favorite book character, who would it be and why?
It's always a hard question for me, but so I have an adult author that I really love. I hope, I get a chance to meet so many middle grade and YA and picture book authors. So all of my kind of people that I really admire, I've actually met, and it's incredible. So I would choose an adult author because I'm not in those circles as much. But there's a Pakistani author, he has a Pakistani background. I think he also lives in the UK. I'm not exactly sure, but his name is Mohsin Hamid.
Mm.
And he wrote a book called Exit West, and it's probably his best known book, but he's written a lot of other books. And I really admire the way that he can talk a lot about identity and borders and war and the things that we're going through, but like in kind of, he uses a lot of magical realism and these sort of really big ideas in these very kind of tightly written, poetic, poignant, but shorter books. So he's just really does a lot in a little space, and I have so much admiration for him. So I'd love to meet him someday
That
and
is
chat.
a great answer. Yeah. So I have absolutely loved learning more about your writing and your life, and I'm certain that everybody else tuning in feels the same way. And if you don't, then I think you should rewatch the interview and read all of Vera's books because I guarantee you're going to realize these books are amazing. So,
Thank you.
you have such an interesting and rich background, and your stories demonstrate this. I, for one, cannot wait to read what you write next. And I hope everybody who's tuning in will find whatever books of yours they've yet to read and read them. Maybe they'll go to the local bookstore or wherever your books are sold, which is pretty much anywhere. And
Yes.
you guys, everybody, you will not regret reading Vera's books. They will become some of your household favorites. So thanks so
You.
much for taking time out of your day to talk to me, Vera. And I'm just such a fan of your stories.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I'm a fan of what you do. So thank you so much for having me.
And everybody, keep reading, stay safe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye. Like, how do I turn? There.